What if the people we were taught to fear were actually the ones doing the healing? That question sounds unusual at first. It might even sound like the beginning of a conspiracy theory. But it is not a theory. It is a question that emerges directly from the historical record. And once you begin looking at that record carefully, the answer becomes harder to ignore. Between the 1400s and the 1700s, somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed across Europe. The exact number is still debated among historians. Some estimates go higher, some go lower, but the range itself is not seriously disputed. Tens of thousands of people were killed over a period of roughly 3 centuries, and the official label attached to nearly all of them was the same, which, the history most of us were taught about this period, follows a familiar shape. Europe was in a state of deep religious fear. Communities were isolated and uneducated. When something went wrong, when a harvest failed, when a child died unexpectedly, when illness moved through a village, people looked for an explanation, and in the absence of scientific understanding, they turned to supernatural ones. Someone must have caused this. Someone must be responsible. The accusation of witchcraft became a way of processing fear and misfortune in a world that did not yet have better tools for doing so. That explanation is not entirely wrong. Fear was real. Religious institutions did play a significant role in how accusations spread. The Malleus Maleficarum, a manual published in 1486 by 2 Dominican inquisitors, described in considerable detail how to identify witches, how to question them, and how to carry out executions. It was printed and distributed widely. It helped standardize what had previously been a scattered and inconsistent process. The document exists. It has been studied. Its influence on the trials is documented. But this is where it becomes unclear. If the trials were purely a product of religious fear and community hysteria, you would expect the pattern of accusation to be essentially random, distributed across different types of people, different roles, different occupations. Fear does not typically target one specific group with unusual consistency. Yet when researchers began examining the actual trial records in detail, something specific emerged. A 2023 study analyzed nearly 4,000 individual cases of witchcraft accusation in Scotland. The researchers were not looking for a pattern. They were trying to build a more complete picture of who was actually accused and why. What they found was that among those whose specific charges involved folk healing or midwifery, 90% were executed, not accused, executed. That number is difficult to place inside the standard explanation of random communal fear. It suggests something more concentrated was happening. This raises questions that the official account does not fully address. The women at the center of this pattern were not mysterious figures living in forests. Many of them were known members of their communities. They were the people others turned to when someone was sick, when a birth was difficult, when a wound would not heal. They worked with plants and herbs whose properties had been tested and passed down across generations. They understood the rhythms of the body in ways that were practical, specific, and effective. This was not superstition dressed up as medicine. It was functional knowledge, built through experience and observation, held by women who were embedded in the communities they served. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because at almost exactly the same time these women were being accused, tried, and executed, a separate and parallel process was underway. University-trained physicians, almost exclusively male, were petitioning governments for legal control over medical practice. As early as the 1300s, English physicians had formally asked Parliament to imprison women who attempted to practice medicine without university credentials. In 1512, a medical act in England required anyone practicing medicine to hold a license from the church or a university. Women were excluded from both institutions entirely. This was not an oversight. It was the structure of the system. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. The timing is difficult to dismiss. The legal exclusion of women from medicine and the mass execution of women who practiced healing happened during the same period. They were not separated by generations. They overlapped. And when you place those two things side by side, the question that emerges is one that standard history has not answered with much precision. Was the elimination of female healers a side effect of religious hysteria? Or was the religious mechanism being used, consciously or not, to clear a specific space. Some historians say the overlap is coincidental, that the trials were local and chaotic, driven by individual conflicts and community dynamics, not by any coordinated effort to reshape medical practice. Others say the consistency across different countries and different decades is too notable to explain away as coincidence. Neither position has been fully proven, and that unresolved space is where this investigation sits. There is one more detail that complicates the official account in a way that is rarely discussed. Paracelsus is considered one of the founders of modern Western medicine. He worked in the 16th century. During the same period the trials were intensifying. In 1527, he publicly burned his own pharmaceutical textbook. He did not burn it because it was useless. He burned it because, in his own words, he had learned more from the women they were calling witches than from anything contained in that book. He said this openly, in public. It was documented. That admission is sitting in the historical record. A man credited as a father of modern medicine acknowledging that the women being executed were, in fact, more knowledgeable than the formal system he represented. And yet that detail is almost never included in the standard account of either the witch trials or the history of medicine. At first, it seems normal to leave out a single quote from a historical figure. But there is a problem. It is not a minor quote. It is a direct statement from one of the period's most significant medical figures, describing the women being killed as his primary source of knowledge. The absence of that detail from mainstream accounts is itself something worth noting. And then there is what happened next. Within a few decades of the trials reaching their peak, the new credentialed medical system was fully established. Universities trained physicians. Governments licensed them. Laws prohibited anyone outside that system from practicing. The knowledge that had once lived in communities, passed freely between women who shared it without charge, was gone. Or at least, it appeared to be gone. But this is where it becomes unclear again. The herbal treatments that traditional healers had used for generations did not disappear from medicine. They appeared in the official pharmacopoeias, the standardized drug references published by the new medical institutions. The plant knowledge was absorbed. It was documented, organized, and then placed inside a system that charged money for access to it. The knowledge survived. The people who held it did not. That sequence is not easy to explain as simple progress. Progress usually involves building on what came before, crediting earlier practitioners, developing knowledge through collaboration. What happened here was different. The practitioners were eliminated. Then their methods were used anyway. And the history was written in a way that described the new system as if it had invented something rather than absorbed it. The question that this raises is a simple one. If the goal was genuinely better medicine, why not learn from the healers rather than eliminate them? Why not incorporate their knowledge through study and collaboration rather than through execution and legal exclusion? Some believe the answer is purely cultural, that the religious framework of the time made it impossible to formally acknowledge knowledge held by women outside the church or university structure, that the executions were not about control, but about the limits of how knowledge could be recognized and transmitted within that specific historical context. This is a serious argument, and it deserves consideration. Others believe the outcome itself is the most important evidence. Regardless of what the intentions were, the result was a transfer of power. Healing moved from being a decentralized, community-held, largely free practice to being a centralized, institutionally controlled, paid profession. And that transfer happened during the same period that tens of thousands of people who embodied the old system were killed. It doesn't fully make sense to treat those two facts as entirely unrelated, but whether they were connected deliberately, incidentally, or structurally remains genuinely unclear. The records from this period are incomplete. Many were lost. Some were never kept. And the people who might have documented the transition, from the perspective of the healers themselves, were not in a position to write anything down. What we have instead are court records, accusation documents, confessions extracted under conditions that historians have described as deeply unreliable, and the silence that follows, a silence where the knowledge those women carried should be, where the oral traditions should have continued, where the community relationships should have persisted. Instead, there's a gap, and on the other side of that gap is the new system, expensive, credentialed, and male. The investigation into this period does not arrive at a clean conclusion. It cannot. The evidence is partial. The interpretations are contested, and the people most central to the story left very few records of their own. But what can be said is this: the standard explanation, fear, superstition, religious extremism, gradual progress, does not fully account for everything in the record. It does not explain why healers were disproportionately targeted. It does not explain the timing of the licensing laws. It does not explain what Paracelsus said and why it was forgotten. It does not explain how the knowledge survived inside the very system that destroyed the people who held it. These are not rhetorical questions designed to point toward a predetermined answer. They are genuine gaps in the historical account, gaps that researchers are still working through, gaps that the standard curriculum rarely acknowledges exist. And that is where this investigation begins, not with a conclusion, not with a claim, but with a pattern that is visible in the record and a set of questions that have not yet been answered fully enough to close the file. What if the people we were taught to fear were actually the ones doing the healing? That question does not have a simple answer, but the fact that it can be asked at all, and supported by documented evidence, suggests that the history we were given may not be the complete one. And incomplete histories have a way of shaping the present in ways we do not always recognize until we start looking more carefully at what was left out. Most history books tell the same story about the witch trials. The explanation is consistent. It appears in textbooks, documentaries, and academic summaries, with very little variation. And on the surface, it is a coherent account. It has a clear cause, a clear progression, and a clear resolution. But coherence is not the same as completeness, and that difference is worth examining slowly. The story begins with the religious environment of medieval and early modern Europe. This was a world organized almost entirely around faith. The church was not simply a place people visited on certain days. It was the framework through which most people understood reality. It explained where the world came from, why suffering existed, what happened after death, and what forces operated beneath the surface of ordinary life. Supernatural forces were not considered unusual or metaphorical. They were considered real, present, active in the world. Within that framework, misfortune required explanation, and the explanations available were mostly supernatural ones. When a harvest failed without obvious cause, when livestock died suddenly, when a healthy child fell ill and did not recover, communities needed a reason. The idea that these things happened randomly, without cause or meaning, was not easy to absorb inside a worldview built on divine order and spiritual warfare. Something must have caused the harm. Someone must have been responsible. That is where accusation entered. When a community could not explain a misfortune through natural means, it sometimes turned toward individuals who seemed different, suspicious, or socially isolated. The accusation of witchcraft became a mechanism for locating blame. And once an accusation was made, the process that followed had very little room for defense. Confession was often the primary form of evidence, and the methods used to obtain confessions were rarely gentle. This raises a basic question that the official explanation tends to pass over quickly. If communities were simply looking for someone to blame when things went wrong, why did the pattern of accusation fall so consistently on certain types of people? Randomness would produce a more varied picture. But the records do not show randomness. They show concentration, and that concentration is something the standard account does not fully explain. The church's institutional role is one of the clearer parts of the accepted explanation. In 1486, two Dominican inquisitors named Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger published a document called the Malleus Maleficarum. The title translates roughly as the Hammer of Witches. It was a manual, detailed and systematic. It described what witchcraft looked like, how to identify those who practiced it, how to conduct trials, how to extract confessions, and how to carry out sentences. It was not a local document. It was printed and distributed. It reached inquisitors, judges, and church officials across multiple countries. Historians credit it with helping to standardize and intensify the persecution that followed. That document exists. It has been studied extensively. Its influence is not seriously disputed, and it does help explain how witch hunting became organized and widespread rather than remaining scattered and inconsistent. But this is where it becomes unclear. because the Malleus Maleficarum was also a deeply specific document in ways that the standard explanation tends to gloss over. It devoted considerable attention to women, to their relationship with the devil, to their particular susceptibility to corruption. It was not a neutral legal manual. It was a document that framed women as inherently more vulnerable to supernatural evil than men, and that framing shaped who got accused. At first, it seems normal to describe the trials as mass hysteria produced by fear and ignorance. That framing is not entirely inaccurate. Fear was genuinely present. Communities were genuinely isolated. Access to the kind of information that might have countered supernatural explanations was limited. Literacy was not widespread. Scientific frameworks for understanding disease and natural disaster were not available to most people. Hysteria, in some documented cases, did spread from person to person in ways that resemble contagion. The Salem trials in colonial America are perhaps the most studied example of this dynamic. But there's a problem with using mass hysteria as the primary explanation. Hysteria is unpredictable. It spreads based on social proximity, shared anxiety, and the specific fears of a particular community at a particular moment. It does not, on its own, produce consistent patterns across different countries, different legal systems, and different decades. And yet the witch trials produced exactly that kind of consistency. The same types of people, the same kinds of charges, the same outcomes, across Scotland, England, Germany, France, and the regions of what is now Switzerland and the Netherlands. That level of consistency across such different contexts is difficult to attribute entirely to spontaneous community fear. The justice system of the period is another element the official explanation addresses, though often briefly. Courts of the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries operated without many of the protections that modern legal systems take for granted. There was no presumption of innocence in any meaningful operational sense. The accused often had no legal representation. Evidence could consist of testimony from a single witness, or from the accused themselves under conditions of extreme duress. Torture was legally permitted in many jurisdictions as a means of obtaining confession, and confession, once obtained, was treated as conclusive. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because a system that uses torture to produce confession and then treats confession as proof is not a system capable of distinguishing between actual guilt and the desire to make the pain stop. The confessions that filled the trial records were not necessarily accurate accounts of what people had done. They were accounts of what people said under conditions designed to produce agreement. That means the historical record of the trials is built significantly on evidence that was extracted rather than discovered. And extracted evidence tells us more about what the questioners wanted to hear than about what the accused actually did. The official explanation handles this by noting that these were simply the standards of the time, that the absence of modern legal protections was a feature of the era, not a deliberate mechanism of persecution. Some historians accept this framing entirely. Others find it incomplete, because the question of who was targeted and how consistently remains. By the 1700s, the trials began to decline. The official explanation attributes this to the Enlightenment, a gradual cultural shift toward rational inquiry, scientific method, and skepticism about supernatural explanations. Educated thinkers began challenging the premises on which the trials had been built. The idea that witches cause crop failures became harder to sustain as natural explanations became available and credible. Courts became more reluctant to convict. Executions became rarer. Eventually, the legal basis for witch trials was removed in most European countries. And alongside this, medicine changed. Formally trained physicians, educated in universities, began to replace the decentralized network of traditional healers. The Enlightenment brought not just philosophical skepticism, but institutional reorganization. Science replaced superstition, the narrative says. Progress arrived. And the logical endpoint of that progress was the modern medical system. That is where the official explanation closes. It is a tidy arc. Ignorance gave way to knowledge. Fear gave way to reason. And the institutions that emerged from that transition represented genuine improvement over what came before. However, the timeline does not fully match that conclusion. The transition from the old healing network to the new credentialed system did not happen the way the progress narrative implies. The traditional healers who were removed from communities were not replaced immediately by accessible, affordable medical care. There was a gap, a long one. The licensed physicians who received legal authority to practice medicine in the 16th and 17th centuries were expensive. They operated primarily in cities. They were not available to the rural communities that had previously relied on local women with herbal knowledge and practical experience. For large portions of the population, the disappearance of traditional healers did not mean the arrival of better medicine. It meant the arrival of nothing. This raises questions the official explanation tends not to linger on. If the transition was genuinely about improving care, why was there no system to fill the gap? Why did the legal elimination of one type of healer precede the availability of a replacement by such a significant margin? Some believe this was simply the pace at which institutions develop, that universities and licensing systems take time to scale. Others point out that the gap was long enough and wide enough to suggest it was not primarily a medical transition at all. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the standard account of the witch trials and the standard account of the rise of modern medicine are usually told as separate histories. The trials are taught as religious and social history. Medicine is taught as scientific history. They occupy different chapters in different textbooks, but they happen at the same time, to the same people, with outcomes that shaped each other directly. The women executed during the trials were not simply victims of religious fear and isolation from everything else happening around them. They existed inside a specific economic and institutional context, a context in which their practice was becoming legally problematic at exactly the moment when a competing system was seeking legal authority. Whether those two things were causally connected or simply concurrent is genuinely unclear. Some believe the official explanation is essentially correct, that the trials were a tragedy produced by the specific conditions of a fearful, religious, pre-scientific era, that the rise of credentialed medicine was a separate and genuine improvement, that reading deliberate coordination into what was essentially historical coincidence overstates the evidence. Others believe the coincidence is too consistent and too consequential to be left at that the pattern of who was targeted and what replaced them deserves more careful examination than the standard narrative provides. Neither position has closed the question. The records that would resolve it are incomplete. Many documents from this period were lost, damaged, or simply never created. The voices of the accused do not survive in any direct form. What survives are the records of the institutions that prosecuted them. And that is one of the quieter problems with the official explanation. It is built almost entirely from the records of one side: courts, church documents, inquisitor manuals, government licensing records. The perspective of the people who were targeted, the knowledge they held, the communities they served, is largely absent. Oral traditions do not leave archives, and the women who carried those traditions were not in a position to document them once the trials began. What the official explanation gives us is a coherent framework built on available evidence. What it does not always acknowledge is how much that evidence was shaped by the institutions that produced it. And that gap between what the records say and what the records are capable of saying is where the questions in this investigation continue to sit. The accepted story is not false, but it may not be complete, and the parts that are missing tend to point in the same direction, toward a transition that was less about replacing ignorance with knowledge and more about replacing one system of care with another, one that was free with one that was not, one that was decentralized with one that was controlled. Whether that transition was designed or simply happened is the question the official explanation has not yet fully answered. The official explanation for the witch trials rests on a particular assumption. That assumption is rarely stated directly, but it runs beneath the entire narrative. The assumption is that fear is essentially random, that when communities are frightened and looking for someone to blame, the accusations that follow are distributed unpredictably across the population. Whoever seemed strange, whoever had recently argued with a neighbor, whoever existed on the margins of community life, for any reason at all. If that assumption is correct, then the pattern of accusation across Europe should look more or less like noise. Different types of people, different occupations, different social roles, a reflection of local tensions, personal conflicts, and the specific anxieties of individual communities, rather than any consistent targeting of a particular group. But that is not quite what the records show. And that gap between what the assumption predicts and what the evidence actually contains is where the first serious doubt in this investigation begins. Researchers who have gone back through the trial records in detail have found something that the standard explanation struggles to account for. The accusations were not random. They were concentrated. Not everywhere and not in every case, but consistently enough, across enough different locations and enough different decades, to raise a question that the official account has not fully answered. Why were certain types of people targeted at rates that do not match what random community fear would produce? A 2023 study examined nearly 4,000 individual cases of witchcraft accusation drawn from Scottish records. Scotland is a useful place to look because its trial documentation is relatively complete compared to many other European regions. Researchers could examine not just who was accused, but what specific charges were brought, what the outcomes were, and what occupational or social roles the accused held. The study was not designed to prove a particular conclusion. It was designed to build a clearer picture of who was actually caught inside the trial system. What emerged from that analysis was specific. Among those whose charges specifically involved folk healing or midwifery, 90% were executed, not accused and released. Not accused and acquitted. Executed. That figure is not a minor statistical variation. It is a pronounced concentration of lethal outcome among people who shared a particular function within their communities. And it sits inside the historical record waiting for an explanation that the standard account has not yet fully provided. At first, it seems normal that healers might attract suspicion in a fearful and deeply religious community. The logic is straightforward enough. People who worked with plants and herbs, who understood the properties of natural materials, who assisted in the unpredictable and sometimes fatal process of childbirth, occupied a space that could easily be misread as supernatural. When a patient recovered unexpectedly, it might seem like magic. When a patient died despite treatment, it might seem like something worse. In a world where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was not clearly drawn, the healer's role placed them close to that boundary in ways that could generate suspicion. That explanation has a certain internal logic, and it probably accounts for some portion of what happened. But there's a problem. It does not account for the scale. It does not account for the consistency. And it does not account for the timing. Because the concentration of accusation among healers did not happen in isolation. It happened alongside something else. Something that was unfolding through entirely different institutions. Through legal petitions and university regulations and government licensing systems at almost exactly the same time. By the 1300s, university-trained physicians in England had already begun petitioning Parliament for legal control over medical practice. These were not informal requests. They were formal legal campaigns directed at the highest levels of government, and their target was specific. They wanted laws that would prohibit anyone without university credentials from treating patients. Anyone who practiced medicine outside the licensed system should face legal consequences. That was the argument being made. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the universities these physicians attended were closed to women. Entirely. Not partially. Not with exceptions. A woman could not enroll in a medieval or early modern European university. She could not obtain the credentials that the licensing laws required, which means that a law requiring university credentials to practice medicine was, in practical effect, a law prohibiting women from practicing medicine. Whether that was the explicit intention or simply the structural outcome is a question the records do not definitively answer. But the effect was the same either way. This raises questions that the official explanation does not fully address. Were the witch trials a product of religious fear operating independently of everything else happening in this period? Or were they connected, in some way that the standard account has not fully mapped, to a concurrent effort to establish legal and institutional control over who was permitted to heal? The overlap in timing is one of the things that makes this question difficult to dismiss. The petitions from university physicians asking for monopoly control over medicine began in the 1300s. The witch trials intensified significantly through the 1400s and 1500s. The two processes were not separated by generations. They ran in parallel. in the same countries, through different institutions, but toward outcomes that reinforced each other. One removed healers through legal exclusion. The other removed them through accusation and execution. And together, they cleared a space that was subsequently filled by the new credentialed system. Some historians look at this and see coincidence. Two separate processes happening simultaneously in the same cultural environment, producing outcomes that happen to align without any necessary connection between them. Religious persecution followed its own internal logic. Medical licensing followed its own institutional logic. The fact that both targeted women in healing roles does not require a single explanation. It may simply reflect the broader conditions of a society in which women were systematically excluded from formal authority across multiple domains at once. That is a serious argument. It cannot be dismissed. The same period that produced the witch trials also produced legal exclusions of women from property ownership, from political participation, from religious leadership, and from virtually every form of institutional authority. The targeting of female healers may simply be one expression of a much broader pattern of exclusion rather than something specific to the medical or healing context. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the execution rate among healers specifically was not the same as the execution rate among accused women generally. The 90% figure from the Scottish study was not the overall execution rate for all accused women. It was the rate specifically for those whose charges involved healing or midwifery. That concentration within an already persecuted group suggests something more targeted than the general pattern of gender-based exclusion. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. If the trials were simply an expression of broad misogyny, you would expect the outcomes to be more evenly distributed across different types of accused women. But they were not. The women most likely to be executed were the ones whose specific role in their communities was healing. That specificity is hard to explain through general patterns alone. The petition records from English physicians in the 1300s are sitting in historical archives. They have been studied. The language in those documents is clear about what the petitioners wanted. They wanted women who practiced medicine without credentials to face imprisonment. They framed this as a matter of protecting patients from incompetent practitioners, but the credential they were requiring was one that no woman could legally obtain. The protective framing and the exclusionary effect were operating simultaneously in the same document. However, the timeline does not fully match the idea that this was simply about patient protection. If the goal was to ensure that practitioners were competent, the most direct path would have been to open the universities to women who demonstrated knowledge and skill. That did not happen. The universities remained closed. The credential remained inaccessible, and the legal prohibition on practicing without it remained in place. The structure of the system made exclusion the only possible outcome, regardless of how individual petitioners framed their intentions. Some believe this reflects the limits of institutional imagination in the period, rather than deliberate suppression, that the men writing those petitions were not thinking primarily about eliminating competition. They were thinking about organizing a profession according to the models available to them, and those models happened to exclude women by default. Others find that explanation too generous. They point to the specificity of the language, the directness of the campaigns, and the consistency of the outcome across multiple countries as evidence of something more purposeful. Neither position can be fully proven from the available records, and that unresolved space is itself part of what makes this period difficult to understand through the standard account alone. What can be said with reasonable confidence is this: the persecution of healers during the witch trial period was not random. The concentration of accusation and execution among women in healing roles is documented. The parallel legal campaign to exclude women from licensed medicine is documented. The timing of both processes, unfolding across the same decades in the same cultural environment, is documented. And the outcome, a transition from decentralized community-based healing to a centralized credentialed system from which women were excluded, is documented. What is not documented clearly is the connection between these things. Whether the legal campaigns and the trials were coordinated, whether they emerged from the same institutional pressures, or whether they simply ran in parallel and reinforced each other by structural accident, remains genuinely unclear. The records that would answer that question directly either do not exist or have not yet been found, and that absence is its own kind of evidence. Not proof of anything deliberate, but a signal that the standard explanation, built on available records produced mostly by the institutions doing the persecuting, may be missing the perspective that would clarify what was actually happening. The trial records describe what was charged. The medical petition records describe what was legally requested. Neither set of documents describes the experience of the women who were caught between them. That silence in the historical record is not unusual for this period. The people with the least institutional power rarely left written archives. But it means that the picture available to researchers is partial. And a partial picture, however coherent it seems, is not the same as a complete one. The first doubt in this investigation is not a refutation of the official explanation. It is a gap inside it. A number, 90%, that does not fit neatly into the narrative of random fear. A timeline that places legal exclusion and lethal persecution in the same decades without explaining the relationship between them. A structure that produced exclusion regardless of intent, and that was never reformed in the direction that genuine concern for patient welfare would have suggested. These are not small details around the edges of the story. They are located at the center of it. And the fact that they remain unresolved in the standard account is the reason this investigation continues into the chapters that follow. Before examining what happened to the healers, it is worth pausing to understand what they actually were. Not what they were called by the institutions that prosecuted them. Not how they appear in the trial records, which were written by their accusers. But what they actually did, what they knew, and what role they played in the communities where they lived and worked. That distinction matters, because the official account of this period tends to describe traditional healers in ways that reflect how they were framed during the persecution rather than how they functioned before it. And those two pictures are quite different. For centuries before formal medicine established itself in Europe, healing knowledge existed in a particular way. It was not located in universities. It was not written in Latin textbooks accessible only to educated men. It lived in communities. It was held by people who were embedded in the same villages and towns as the people they treated. It moved through conversation, through practice, through the passing of specific knowledge from one person to the next across generations. And it was held primarily by women. This was not a primitive system operating in the absence of better options. It was a functional system that had developed over a very long period of time. The knowledge it contained was specific, particular plants for particular conditions, methods for managing the progression of labor, approaches to wound care and infection that had been observed, tested, and refined through repeated use across many generations. The women who held this knowledge were not guessing. They were applying what had been learned through sustained practical experience in the communities where healing actually happened. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the standard narrative about this period implies that the healing knowledge being replaced was largely ineffective, that the transition to formal, credentialed medicine represented a move from superstition and guesswork toward something genuinely better. But that implication rests on an assumption about the quality of traditional healing knowledge that the historical evidence does not fully support. Some of what traditional healers used was, by later scientific analysis, genuinely effective. Willow bark, which was used for pain and fever, contains compounds that are the basis of aspirin. Certain molds used on wounds have properties related to antibiotic action. Plants used to slow bleeding, to ease labor, to manage digestive illness, have been found to contain active compounds that correspond to their traditional applications. This does not mean everything traditional healers used was correct. It means the knowledge base was not simply superstition dressed up as medicine. It had a real foundation, built through observation over time, that the formal system which replaced it later had to rediscover through different methods. And this is where the explanation starts to weaken. If the women who practiced traditional healing were ignorant and dangerous, if their knowledge was primitive and unreliable, then the transition to formal medicine would make straightforward sense as progress, better replacing worse, knowledge replacing ignorance. But if their knowledge was functional and tested and effective enough to be absorbed and built upon by the system that replaced them, then the transition looks different. It looks less like improvement and more like transfer, a transfer of knowledge from one group to another, without credit, and with the original holders eliminated in the process. The most direct evidence for this comes from an unlikely source. Paracelsus is a name that appears in the history of medicine with considerable frequency. He worked in the 16th century. He challenged the dominant medical theories of his time. He introduced the use of chemicals and minerals into pharmaceutical practice. He insisted on direct observation rather than reliance on ancient texts. For these reasons, he is sometimes called the father of modern medicine, or the father of toxicology. He is credited with helping to move European medicine toward a more empirical foundation. In 1527, Paracelsus publicly burned his own pharmaceutical textbook. This was not a private moment. It was a public act. He did it in front of students, and he explained why. He stated that he had learned more from the women they were calling witches than from anything contained in the book he was burning or from anything he had been taught in universities. That statement exists in the historical record. It has been documented, and it raises a question that is very difficult to answer within the framework of the standard narrative. If the knowledge held by traditional female healers was primitive and ineffective, why was one of the founding figures of modern medicine publicly crediting them as his primary source of education? Why was the book representing formal university medicine the one being burned, rather than the oral traditions of the women being accused? Some believe Paracelsus was being rhetorical, that his statement was an expression of frustration with the rigidity of academic medicine rather than a literal description of where he had learned his methods, that he was making a point about the arrogance of universities rather than genuinely attributing his knowledge to the women being prosecuted. That reading is possible. Paracelsus was known for provocative statements, and placing his words in context is a reasonable methodological caution. But this is where it becomes unclear, because even if the statement was partly rhetorical, it points to something real. Paracelsus had access to traditional healing knowledge. He engaged with it. He found it valuable enough to reference publicly at a moment when the women who held it were being executed as dangerous practitioners of evil. The gap between how those women were being officially characterized and how at least one significant figure in formal medicine actually regarded their knowledge is not a small gap. It is substantial, and it has not been fully explained. The oral tradition through which healing knowledge was transmitted is itself an important part of the background. Oral transmission is often treated as a lesser form of knowledge preservation compared to written records. It is associated with impermanence, with distortion, with the limits of human memory. But oral traditions that survive across many generations do so because they are repeatedly tested and corrected against practical outcomes. A plant remedy that consistently failed would not survive in an oral tradition for centuries. It would be dropped. The remedies that persisted were the ones that worked often enough to be worth remembering and passing on. This does not mean oral traditions are infallible. They are not. They can carry errors alongside effective knowledge. They can mix practical medicine with ritual elements in ways that make it difficult to separate one from the other. And they lack the systematic verification processes that later scientific methods developed. These are genuine limitations, but they are different from the accusation that traditional healing knowledge was simply wrong. However, the timeline does not fully match the idea that this knowledge was simply left behind as medicine advanced. The formal pharmacopoeias that emerged from European medical institutions in the 16th and 17th centuries drew heavily on herbal knowledge. Plant-based treatments that appeared in those official documents had clear parallels in the traditional healing practices that were being suppressed during the same period. The knowledge did not disappear. It was documented, organized, and institutionalized. But the people who had developed and held that knowledge were not part of that process. They were excluded from it, or they were already gone. That sequence is worth sitting with. The healers were removed. Then their knowledge was incorporated into the system that replaced them. Then the history was written in a way that described the new system as an advance over what came before, without clearly accounting for where much of its foundational knowledge actually originated. Some historians argue this is not unusual in the history of knowledge, that ideas move between systems without always carrying credit for their origins, that the absorption of traditional knowledge into formal medicine was a natural part of how institutions develop, and that reading deliberate suppression into what was essentially a disorganized transfer overstates the evidence. This is a reasonable position, and it deserves consideration. Others point to the specific circumstances of the transfer. The people who held the knowledge were not simply uncredited. They were legally excluded from the institutions that later used their knowledge. They were accused of crimes. They were executed. The transfer happened not through collaboration or acknowledgement, but through a process that destroyed the source while preserving certain elements of what it contained. That is a specific kind of transfer with a specific character, and describing it simply as the normal movement of ideas between systems may not fully capture what it actually was. The background details of this period do not support a straightforward progress narrative. They support something more complicated, a transition in which real and functional knowledge was held by a specific group of people. That group was removed through legal and violent means, and the knowledge was then absorbed into a new system that did not credit its origins and charged money for access to what had previously been available within communities for free. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because if the replacement was genuinely about improving care, the most direct path would have involved the healers themselves. Their knowledge was real enough for Paracelsus to credit publicly. Their methods were effective enough to be absorbed into formal pharmacology. Their experience with childbirth, infection, pain, and plant medicine was specific and tested. If the goal was better medicine, they were an obvious resource. But they were not used as a resource. They were eliminated, and their knowledge was used afterward, without them, by people who had participated in or at minimum operated alongside the system that removed them. That detail sits in the background of this period without a clear explanation. Some believe it reflects the structural impossibility of formally incorporating women into a male-controlled institutional system during that era, that the exclusion was real but incidental to the knowledge question. Others believe the two things cannot be separated that cleanly, that the exclusion of the people and the absorption of the knowledge were part of the same process, rather than independent developments that happened to coincide. The records left from this period cannot resolve that question directly. What they can do is complicate the assumption that the transition was simply progress. The knowledge being replaced was not ignorance. The people holding it were not primitive practitioners stumbling in the dark. One of the men credited with founding the medicine that replaced them said so publicly, in 1527, in front of students, while burning the book that was supposed to represent everything formal medicine had to offer. That admission has been sitting in the historical record for nearly 5 centuries. It is rarely discussed in the standard account of either the witch trials or the history of medicine, and the question of why it is rarely discussed is itself a question this investigation has not yet found a complete answer to. There's a detail about this period that does not appear in most standard accounts. It is not hidden in obscure archives or buried beneath layers of academic complexity. It is sitting in legal history, in documented records of legislation and institutional petitions, in sources that have been studied and cataloged. But it rarely appears in the same conversation as the witch trials, and that separation between the legal history and the persecution history may be part of why the full picture has remained difficult to see. The witch trials and the rise of formal medical licensing happened at the same time, not in adjacent centuries, not in overlapping generations in a loose historical sense. At the same time, in the same countries, often in the same decades, and the outcomes of both processes pointed in the same direction, away from decentralized, community-based, female-held healing and toward a centralized, credentialed, institutionally controlled system from which women were structurally excluded. That parallel has not been fully explained, and the closer it is examined, the more difficult it becomes to treat as coincidence. To understand what the licensing laws actually did, it helps to understand what the healing landscape looked like before they arrived. Across medieval Europe, healing was not organized through institutions. It was organized through communities. People who needed care turned to people within their own villages and towns who held relevant knowledge. Those people were often women. They knew which plants addressed which conditions. They understood the management of fever, infection, pain, and the process of childbirth. They had learned through practice and through the transmission of knowledge from earlier generations. They did not charge fees in the way that formal practitioners later would. They operated within the reciprocal social structures of community life, and they were present. They were local. They were accessible in a way that formal medicine, for most of history, was not. This is the system that the licensing laws effectively made illegal. Not gradually, not with provisions for transition or replacement, directly and immediately. In England, the Medical Act of 1512 established that anyone wishing to practice medicine had to be licensed. The license had to come from either the church or a university. There was no third option. There was no provision for demonstrating knowledge through examination outside those two institutions. There was no pathway for practitioners who had learned through experience and oral tradition rather than through formal study. The law defined legitimate medicine entirely through institutional affiliation, and both institutions named in the law were closed to women. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because a law that requires a credential that one group of people cannot legally obtain is not simply a quality standard. It is an exclusion. Whatever language was used to justify it, whatever framing was applied to make it seem like patient protection, the structural effect was unambiguous. Women who had been practicing healing within their communities were now practicing illegally. They could not become legal under the terms the law established. The path to legitimacy did not exist for them. Some historians argue that the intent behind these laws was genuinely protective, that the medical landscape of the early 16th century contained real incompetence alongside real skill, that patients were harmed by unqualified practitioners, that the licensing system was an attempt, however imperfect, to establish some baseline of quality control. This argument is reasonable. It cannot be dismissed entirely. Standards in any field have to come from somewhere, and the effort to distinguish between practitioners who knew what they were doing and those who did not was not inherently malicious. But there is a problem. If the goal was patient protection, the most direct expression of that goal would have been a system for verifying knowledge and competence, regardless of where that knowledge came from. The licensing laws did not do that. They did not test what practitioners knew. They tested where practitioners had been educated. Those are different things, and the distinction matters, because one of them is about competence and the other is about institutional membership. The laws chose institutional membership, and institutional membership was available only to men. This raises questions about what was actually being protected: patient welfare, or the market position of a specific group of practitioners who had already obtained institutional credentials and now wanted legal authority to exclude competition. The petitions that preceded these laws are documented. As early as the 1300s, university-trained physicians in England had formally requested that Parliament take legal action against women practicing medicine without credentials. Those petitions exist in historical records. They were not anonymous. They came from identified professional groups making specific arguments to specific legislative bodies, and the arguments they made were framed in terms of patient protection. But the outcome they requested was monopoly control. And those two things, patient protection and monopoly control, can appear in the same document while serving very different purposes. However, the timeline does not fully match the patient protection explanation. If the primary concern was patient welfare, the period immediately following the licensing laws should show improved access to care for the communities that had previously relied on traditional healers. That is not what happened. What happened was a gap, a significant and documented gap in access to healing for people who could not afford licensed physicians and no longer had access to the women who had previously treated them. The licensed system was expensive. This is not a matter of interpretation. It is a structural feature of credentialed professional practice. People who complete long formal educations and hold institutional licenses charge for their services in ways that reflect the cost of obtaining those credentials. That is how professional systems work. And in the 16th and 17th centuries, that cost placed formal medical care out of reach for the majority of the population. Rural communities had the least access. The poor had the least access. The people who had depended most heavily on local traditional healers were the people who gained the least from the transition to formal medicine. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because a transition that removed accessible care from a large portion of the population and replaced it with expensive care that most of that population could not access is difficult to describe as primarily a public health improvement. It may have been an improvement for the people who could afford it, For others, it represented the disappearance of the only healing system they had ever had access to. The gap that followed was not short. It lasted for generations. Community-based traditional healing did not simply hand over its functions to a new system and step aside in an orderly transition. It was legally prohibited. Then it was gone. And the system that was supposed to fill the space it left was not present in the places that needed it, and not affordable for the people who needed it most. Some believe this gap was an unintended consequence of an otherwise well-intentioned reform, that the architects of the licensing system did not design it with the intention of leaving poor and rural communities without care, that the failure to provide for continuity of access was an oversight rather than a feature. Others find that framing difficult to sustain across the full duration of the gap. Oversights that last for generations and affect the majority of a population while benefiting a specific credentialed minority are difficult to distinguish in their effects from deliberate policy. The question of intent may ultimately be unanswerable from the available records, but the question of outcome is not. The outcome is documented. Care became less accessible. It became more expensive. It became controlled by a smaller group, and the people who had previously provided it were first legally excluded and then, through the parallel mechanism of the trials, physically eliminated. It doesn't fully make sense that all of these things happened simultaneously by accident. That is not a claim of conspiracy. It is an observation about probability. When multiple institutional processes, operating through different mechanisms in different arenas, produce the same directional outcome at the same time, the most parsimonious explanation is usually that they share a common cause or a common structural logic. What that cause or logic was in this case is not fully clear, but the simultaneous convergence of legal exclusion, religious persecution, and institutional monopolization around the same target population in the same period is not easily explained by coincidence alone. There is another element of this period that is rarely discussed alongside the licensing laws and the trials. The knowledge itself. What happened to the healing knowledge that had been held in communities, passed through oral tradition, and practiced by the women who were now being legally excluded and physically removed? Some of it was lost. Oral traditions that are not practiced do not survive. When the people who held specific knowledge were no longer able to practice, when the social networks through which that knowledge moved were disrupted or destroyed, some of what they knew simply stopped being transmitted. There is no archive for a plant remedy that was never written down and whose last practitioner was executed or legally barred from continuing. That knowledge is gone. How much was lost in this way cannot be fully measured, because the absence of something that was never recorded is invisible. But some of it was not lost. Some of it was absorbed. The formal pharmacopoeias that emerged from European medical institutions in the 16th and 17th centuries contained plant-based treatments with clear parallels to traditional healing practices. The knowledge moved. It moved from an oral, community-based, female-held system into a written, institutionally controlled, male-administered one. And in that movement, the knowledge was preserved while the people who had developed it were removed from the picture entirely. That sequence is one of the quieter inconsistencies in the standard account of this period. The official narrative describes the rise of formal medicine as the replacement of inferior knowledge with superior knowledge, but the evidence suggests that significant portions of the knowledge base were the same. What changed was not primarily the content of the healing knowledge. What changed was who controlled access to it, under what legal authority, and at what cost to the people seeking care. And this is where the explanation starts to weaken most clearly, because if the knowledge was largely continuous, if much of what formal medicine used had roots in the traditional practices being suppressed, then the transition was not primarily about replacing wrong ideas with right ones. It was about replacing one system of access with another. And the new system was structurally designed to be more expensive, more exclusive, and more controlled than anything that had come before it. The gap that followed the disappearance of traditional healers has not been fully explained. It sits in the historical record as a period of reduced access, higher cost, and narrower availability. And the question of whether that gap was a regrettable side effect of genuine reform or a predictable outcome of institutional consolidation has not yet received a satisfying answer from the standard account. That question remains open, and the chapters that follow will continue to examine why. There is a particular detail about this period that tends to get passed over in the standard account. It is not dramatic. It does not involve executions or courtrooms or formal declarations. It involves something quieter and in some ways more revealing. It involves what happened to the knowledge itself after the people who held it were gone. The assumption built into the official narrative is that traditional healing knowledge was replaced by something better, that the formal medical system which emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries represented a genuine advance over what came before, that the transition, whatever its costs, moved medicine in the direction of greater accuracy, greater effectiveness, and greater benefit to patients. That is the framework through which the rise of credentialed medicine is almost universally presented. But this is where it becomes unclear, because when researchers examine what the early formal medical system actually contained, what treatments it used, what substances it prescribed, what plant-based remedies appeared in its official references, the picture that emerges is not one of replacement. It is one of absorption, and absorption is a very different thing from replacement. A pharmacopoeia is an official reference document. It lists substances used in medicine, describes their properties, and establishes standards for their preparation and use. The first official pharmacopoeias in Europe appeared in the 16th century. They were produced by medical institutions and carried institutional authority. They were written in Latin, organized systematically, and distributed through the channels of formal medicine. They looked, in form and presentation, like the products of a new and rigorous system. But the contents of those documents were not entirely new. Researchers who have compared the plant-based treatments listed in early European pharmacopoeias with the herbal knowledge documented from traditional healing practices have found substantial overlap. The same plants, the same applications, the same basic understanding of which natural substances addressed which conditions. The formal system did not invent this knowledge. It documented knowledge that already existed, organized it according to its own institutional conventions, and then placed it inside a structure that charged for access. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the question it raises is a direct one. If the knowledge already existed, and if the formal system was drawing on that existing knowledge to build its own pharmacological foundation, then what exactly was being improved? The knowledge base was continuous. What changed was the institutional structure around it, and the institutional structure that replaced the old one was more expensive, more exclusive, and more controlled than what it succeeded. Some believe this is simply how knowledge transfer works across historical periods. Ideas do not stay contained within the systems that produce them. They move. They get picked up by new institutions and reformulated in new contexts. The fact that formal medicine absorbed traditional healing knowledge does not necessarily mean anything sinister was happening. It may simply reflect the normal process by which useful knowledge gets incorporated into more organized systems over time. This is a reasonable position, and it represents how many historians of medicine understand the transition. But there's a problem with that framing when it is applied to this specific case. Normal knowledge transfer, the kind that happens through the ordinary movement of ideas between systems, typically involves some relationship between the source and the destination. The people who hold knowledge share it, demonstrate it, teach it, or at minimum are observed and credited. What happened during this period was different. The people who held the knowledge were not consulted. They were not invited to participate in the documentation process. They were not credited in the pharmacopoeias that drew on their methods. They were legally excluded from the institutions producing those documents, and many of them were executed during the same period that those documents were being compiled. The transfer happened without the people. The knowledge moved. The practitioners did not. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because a knowledge transfer that happens after the source population has been legally barred and physically eliminated is not the same thing as ordinary institutional absorption. It has a specific character. The knowledge arrives in the new system without its origins being acknowledged. It is presented as the product of the new system's own inquiry, and the people whose experience and observation produced that knowledge receive no recognition, because they are no longer present to claim any. Paracelsus is again relevant here. He stated publicly that he had learned from the women being called witches. He admitted the debt directly. But Paracelsus occupied a specific position. He held university credentials. He was male. He operated within the institutional framework of formal medicine even as he criticized it. His admission was tolerated, perhaps even dismissed as provocation, because he was inside the system. He could say what he learned and from whom, without facing the consequences that the women he was crediting faced for simply practicing what they knew. That asymmetry is worth examining carefully. The same knowledge held by a woman in a village led to accusation and execution. Held by a credentialed male physician who had learned it from that woman, it led to recognition as a pioneering figure in the history of medicine. The knowledge did not change. The institutional position of the person holding it was what determined whether it was treated as dangerous or as valuable. This raises a question that sits at the center of this chapter. What exactly was being managed during this transition? The official explanation says it was quality of care, that the licensing systems and the exclusions and the institutional reorganization were all in the service of making medicine more reliable and more beneficial to patients. But the evidence from the knowledge transfer suggests something more complicated. If the goal was better medicine, the most direct path would have involved the people who already had the relevant knowledge, learning from them, incorporating their experience, acknowledging their expertise, and building on it through systematic study. That is not what happened. What happened was that those people were removed, and then their knowledge was used anyway, which means the removal was not necessary for the knowledge to be preserved. The knowledge would have been available with the practitioners still present. Their elimination served some purpose other than knowledge acquisition, and the question of what that purpose was has not been clearly answered. Some researchers have pointed to economic logic as the most plausible explanation. Traditional healers operated within community reciprocity structures. They did not charge fees in the manner of formal professionals. The healing they provided was largely free, or exchanged through social obligations that did not involve money. A credentialed system, by contrast, required payment. It generated income for practitioners. It created a market for medical services where one had not previously existed in the same form. Moving healing from a community resource into a paid professional service required, at minimum, that the free alternative be unavailable. As long as communities had access to local women who would treat them without charge, the demand for expensive licensed physicians would be limited. The removal of traditional healers was not just a religious or institutional event. It was also, in its structural effects, the creation of a market. Whether that market creation was a deliberate goal or an incidental outcome of other priorities is not clear from the available records, but the economic logic is consistent with the sequence of events. However, the timeline does not fully match a purely economic explanation either. Economic motivations would predict a targeted, efficient removal of direct competition. What actually happened was more chaotic. The trials were not uniform. They were local and inconsistent in many ways. Not every traditional healer was accused. Not every region experienced the same intensity of persecution. And the economic logic, while consistent with the outcome, does not fully explain the religious and legal mechanisms through which the removal was carried out. This is one of the places where the investigation becomes genuinely uncertain. Multiple explanations are in play simultaneously. Religious dynamics, economic interests, professional monopolization, and institutional gender exclusion were all present in the same period. They reinforced each other in ways that made the outcome more consistent than any single explanation would predict. But disentangling them, determining which was primary and which was secondary, requires evidence that the available records do not fully provide. What the records do provide is the outcome, and the outcome is specific. The knowledge was absorbed. The practitioners were removed. The new system charged for access to methods that had previously been freely available, and the history was written in a way that described this sequence as progress. There is an additional layer to this that makes the picture more uncomfortable. Not all of the traditional knowledge was successfully absorbed. Some of it was lost. The oral traditions that did not get written down before the practitioners were removed simply stopped existing. Plant knowledge that was never documented, methods that were specific to particular communities, approaches to particular conditions that existed only in the memories of people who were executed or legally silenced. Those things are gone. There's no way to recover them. There's no archive where they are waiting to be rediscovered. They were carried in people. And when the people were removed, they went with them. This means the transition did not only transfer knowledge from one system to another, it also destroyed knowledge. How much was destroyed cannot be measured, but the possibility that effective treatments, tested across generations of practical application, were lost because the people who held them were eliminated before anyone thought to document what they knew, is a genuine historical possibility, and it is one that the standard account of medical progress does not typically address. The question that this chapter keeps returning to is the one that the official explanation has not answered clearly. If the goal was simply better medicine, the approach taken makes very little sense. You do not improve medicine by destroying its practitioners before studying what they know. You do not advance healing by creating a gap in access that lasts for generations. You do not protect patients by replacing a free system with an expensive one and leaving most of the population without care in the interval. Each of those outcomes is inconsistent with the primary goal of improving patient welfare. Each of them is consistent with the primary goal of controlling who provides care and profiting from the provision of it. Whether that was the actual goal, or whether it was a structural outcome that emerged from a combination of religious, institutional, and economic pressures without being deliberately designed, remains genuinely unclear. But the pattern is visible. The knowledge was real. The practitioners were removed. The knowledge was repackaged and sold. And the history was written as if the new system had invented what it had actually absorbed. That sequence raises a question that this investigation has not yet found a complete answer to. What exactly was being managed here? And who, in the end, benefited most from how it was managed? At a certain point in any investigation, individual pieces of evidence stop being the primary focus. What becomes more significant is the shape they make when placed alongside each other. And the shape that emerges from this particular investigation is one that is difficult to ignore once it becomes visible. The events examined so far have been treated as separate historical episodes. The dissolution of English monasteries under Henry VIII, the witch trials, and the suppression of traditional female healers across Europe, the Flexner Report, and the closure of medical schools in early 20th century America. Each of these is usually taught as its own story, with its own causes, its own context, and its own cast of characters. They appear in different chapters of different textbooks. They are studied by different academic specialties, and because they are kept separate, the sequence they share is rarely examined directly. But when they are placed in order, the sequence becomes visible, and the sequence is the same each time. First, existing healers or healing institutions are labeled as illegitimate. The label varies depending on the period. In the witch trial era, traditional female practitioners were called dangerous, heretical, and supernaturally corrupt. During the dissolution of the monasteries, the religious institutions running hospitals were characterized as corrupt, inefficient, and spiritually compromised. In 1910, alternative medical schools and the practitioners they trained were described as unscientific, undertrained, and harmful to public health. The specific language changes across centuries. The function of the language does not. It establishes that what currently exists is not legitimate, and that establishment is always the first step. Second, the practice is criminalized or institutionally destroyed. In the witch trial period, licensing laws made traditional healing illegal, and the trials removed practitioners through execution. Under Henry VIII, royal authority dismantled 900 religious institutions in 4 years. After the Flexner Report, regulatory and funding pressure closed more than half of all American medical schools within 25 years. In each case, the removal was not gradual. It was concentrated. It happened in a relatively short period of time and left behind a landscape that looked fundamentally different from what had existed before. Third, the knowledge is either destroyed or absorbed. Some of what traditional healers knew was lost when the practitioners were removed. Some of it was incorporated into the new formal system without credit. After the dissolution of English monasteries, centuries of medical institutional knowledge scattered or disappeared. After the witch trials, the plant-based knowledge held in oral tradition partially survived by moving into formal pharmacological documentation. After the Flexner Report, Certain treatment approaches survived inside the pharmaceutical model while others, particularly those associated with nutrition, herbal medicine, and community-based care, were excluded from the system that received all subsequent funding and institutional support. And fourth, history is rewritten to describe what happened as progress. The dissolution of the monasteries is rarely discussed in terms of its healthcare consequences. The witch trials are taught as a story about religious fear rather than a story about the suppression of a competing healing system. The Flexner Report is described in most medical histories as a turning point in scientific reform, a necessary correction that raised standards and improved patient outcomes. Each time, the narrative that follows the disruption frames the disruption itself as beneficial. And because that narrative becomes the dominant one, the losses are not tallied against the gains. They are simply not discussed. This raises questions. When the same four-step sequence appears 3 times across 5 centuries, in different countries, through different institutional mechanisms, and under different official justifications, the question of whether this represents coincidence becomes genuinely difficult to answer. Some believe it does represent coincidence, or more precisely, they argue that similar outcomes can emerge from similar structural pressures without any connective tissue between the specific events. Institutions consolidate. Professions seek monopoly control. Those with existing credentials use legal and political mechanisms to exclude competition. These dynamics appear across many industries and many periods of history. Medicine is not unique in having experienced them. The pattern in this reading reflects the general tendency of organized professional groups to seek and protect market control. It does not require a specific connection between the dissolution of English monasteries and the Flexner Report. That argument has real merit. It does not require coordination between distant events to explain why they share structural features. It simply requires that the same human tendencies toward consolidation and control express themselves similarly in similar circumstances. And that is a reasonable observation about how institutions behave. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the argument from general institutional tendency does not fully account for the specific details of each episode. The Flexner Report was not simply the medical profession consolidating in a general sense. It was, as documented in a 2025 peer-reviewed article in the journal Curious, a coordinated effort between the Carnegie Foundation and the American Medical Association. Carnegie Foundation President Henry Pritchett wrote directly to AMA leader Arthur Bevan before the report was published. The letter described their collaboration as working hand in glove. It explicitly noted the importance of not revealing their connection publicly until the report appeared. That is not a general institutional tendency. That is a documented coordination between specific named individuals acting through specific named institutions toward a specific shared goal. That level of specificity changes the nature of the pattern. It moves at least one instance of the sequence from the category of structural coincidence into the category of documented deliberate action. And if one instance was deliberate, the question of whether the others shared a similar character becomes more rather than less significant. The monastery dissolution under Henry VIII was also not simply a general institutional consolidation. It was a specific royal policy with named architects. Thomas Cromwell coordinated the inspections and the legal mechanisms. The wealth was redistributed to specific political allies. The destruction of 900 institutions in 4 years was not an organic process. It was administered. And the healthcare consequences, the loss of hospitals that had operated for centuries, the disappearance of the almshouses and infirmaries that the monasteries ran, were either overlooked or accepted as collateral damage by people who understood what they were doing. However, the timeline does not fully match the idea that these were purely separate events with no relationship to each other. The cumulative effect of the 3 episodes is what makes the pattern most visible. After the monastery dissolution, England had no provincial hospitals for 200 years. After the witch trials, decentralized community healing was legally prohibited and its practitioners gone. After the Flexner Report, every homeopathic college was closed. Every naturopathic college was closed, and 5 of 7 black medical schools were permanently shut down. The cumulative result of these 3 disruptions, spread across 5 centuries, was a medical system that was vastly more expensive, vastly more centralized, and controlled by a vastly smaller group of credentialed practitioners than anything that had existed before any of them. That outcome is not what you would expect from three independent reform efforts that happen to share a surface similarity. It is what you would expect from a repeated process that consistently produced the same directional result regardless of the specific mechanisms used in each instance. The case of the black medical schools is worth examining on its own terms because it illustrates the consequences of the pattern with unusual clarity. 5 schools closed after the Flexner Report. Researchers have estimated that had those schools remained open, they could have trained between 30,000 and 35,000 additional black physicians over the following century. Today, less than 4% of practicing American doctors are black. More than 80% of black physicians trained at Howard University or Meharry Medical College, the 2 schools that survived. The AMA formally apologized for its role in the closures in 2008. That apology came 98 years after the report was published. An entire century of missing physicians. Entire communities without doctors who shared their background, their language, or their experience. That is not a minor side effect of reform. It is a structural consequence that shaped access to healthcare for generations. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the Flexner Report is still taught in most medical education contexts as a landmark of scientific reform. The closure of schools is acknowledged, but it is usually framed as a necessary cost of raising standards. The specific communities that lost access, the specific practitioners who were excluded, the century-long consequences for medical diversity. These details appear in the footnotes of the official account rather than in its main text. The same rewriting that followed the monastery dissolution and the witch trials followed the Flexner Report as well. The disruption was real. The framing that followed it described it as progress. At first, it seems normal that any reform would have costs alongside benefits. That is true of most significant institutional changes, but there is a problem with applying that framing uniformly across these 3 episodes. In each case, the costs were concentrated in specific populations: the poor, the rural, women, black Americans, communities that were already underserved and that lost whatever access they had possessed when the disruption happened. And the benefits were concentrated in a smaller, more credentialed, more institutionally connected group. The direction of the redistribution was consistent across all 3 episodes, and that consistency is not explained by the general costs of reform framing. Some believe the directional consistency reflects the social structures of each period, rather than anything specific to medicine, that every major institutional change tends to benefit those with existing power and harm those without it, that medicine was simply following the same pattern as other domains. Others argue that medicine occupies a specific position because healing is not optional. People do not choose whether to need care. The stakes of access are higher than in many other domains, and a pattern that consistently reduces access for the most vulnerable while concentrating control in fewer hands carries a different weight in this context than it would in, say, the history of publishing or architecture. Both positions have merit. Neither fully closes the question. What can be said is that the pattern exists. It is visible in the records. It spans 5 centuries and 3 different continents. It operated through different mechanisms each time, but produced the same directional outcome. And each time it ran. The official account that followed described it not as a disruption, but as an improvement. Is a pattern that repeats 3 times across 5 centuries still coincidence? Some believe yes. The structural pressures that produce consolidation and exclusion are common enough to explain similar outcomes without requiring connection. Others disagree. They point to the specificity of the documentation in the Flexner case, the deliberateness of the monastery dissolution, the concentration of outcomes among the same categories of people across all 3 episodes, as evidence that something more than coincidence is at work. The investigation does not resolve that question here, but it notes that the question has been raised by the evidence itself, and that is not a small thing. The consequences of removing traditional healers from communities did not stay contained within the boundaries of medicine. That is one of the details that the standard account consistently underestimates. The discussion of what was lost tends to focus on treatment methods, on specific plant remedies and birthing practices and wound care techniques. Those losses were real, but they were not the only losses, and in some ways, they were not even the most significant ones. What also disappeared when traditional healers were removed was a relationship, a specific kind of relationship between the person providing care and the person receiving it. And that relationship had characteristics that the system which replaced it did not replicate, and has not replicated since. Traditional healers were local. They lived in the same communities as the people they treated. They knew their patients not as cases or presenting conditions, but as people. They knew family histories, not because those histories were recorded in files, but because they had been present for them. They knew which members of a household were prone to particular ailments. They knew the circumstances of specific pregnancies, specific illnesses, specific recoveries and losses. The knowledge they brought to any individual situation was shaped by continuous proximity and accumulated familiarity with the specific people in their care. That kind of relationship is difficult to quantify. It does not appear in the kind of records that historians most easily study, but its effects were real. People who are known to their healers receive different care than people who are strangers to them. The healer who knows a patient's full context makes different decisions than one who is meeting that patient for the first time in a formal setting. Trust changes what patients report and how accurately they describe what they are experiencing. Familiarity changes how healers interpret what they observe. The local embedded relationship between traditional healers and their communities was not just a social feature of a pre-modern system. It was a functional component of how care actually worked. When that relationship was removed, something specific was lost that could not simply be transferred into the new formal system along with the plant remedies and the procedural knowledge. The licensed system that replaced traditional healing operated on a fundamentally different model. It was institutional rather than relational. It was urban rather than distributed. It was accessed through formal appointments rather than through community presence. And it was administered, in almost every case, by people who were strangers to the patients they saw. This is not a sentimental observation about the warmth of traditional community life. It is a structural observation about how care was organized and what happened when that organization changed. The formal system required patients to come to it. Traditional healing had gone to the patients. The formal system required payment before or at the point of service. Traditional healing had operated within community reciprocity structures that did not work that way. The formal system was concentrated in cities and towns large enough to support credentialed practices. Traditional healing had existed wherever communities existed, regardless of size or urban status. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the scale of what this meant for ordinary people is rarely discussed in the standard account of medical progress. The narrative of improvement focuses on what the new system offered to people who could access it. It does not focus with equal attention on what happened to the people who could not. For generations after the licensing laws removed traditional healers from legal practice, large portions of the European population had no reliable access to any medical care at all. This is not an inference or an interpretation. It is a documented historical condition. Rural communities that had depended on local women with healing knowledge lost that access when those women were prohibited from practicing. They did not gain access to licensed physicians as a replacement. Licensed physicians were expensive. They were rare outside cities. They operated within a fee-based system that most rural and poor people could not participate in. The gap between what was removed and what replaced it was not a temporary adjustment period. It was a sustained condition that lasted across generations. There were no provincial hospitals anywhere in Britain by 1735. That is almost 200 years after the dissolution of the monasteries removed the institutional health care that had existed before. 200 years during which ordinary people outside major cities had essentially no organized access to medical care of any kind. That number, 200 years, is not a detail around the edges of the story. It is one of its most significant features, and it appears in the standard account, when it appears at all, as a footnote rather than as a central consequence. At first, it seems normal to describe this as the inevitable pace of institutional development, that building a new system takes time, that the gap between the removal of the old and the establishment of the new is simply what transition looks like. But there's a problem with that framing. 200 years is not a transition period. It is a condition that affected the health and survival of multiple generations of people who needed care and had no way to access it. And the gap did not close uniformly when it eventually began to close. It closed first for people in cities, for people who could afford fees, for people whose communities were large enough to support formal practices, the rural poor, the communities furthest from urban centers, the people with the least economic resources. These populations waited longest, and in some cases, what they eventually gained access to was still expensive enough to be practically inaccessible for significant portions of their number. The Flexner Report episode in America added a specific dimension to this problem that extends the pattern into the 20th century with documented consequences that are still measurable today. When the report led to the closure of 5 of the 7 existing black medical schools, the effect was not abstract. It removed the primary institutional pathway through which black physicians were being trained in the United States. Howard University and Meharry Medical College survived. Every other black medical school closed permanently. Researchers have estimated that had those 5 schools remained open and continued producing graduates at reasonable rates, they could have trained between 30,000 and 35,000 additional black physicians over the following century. That is not a speculative number in the sense of being invented. It is a projection based on enrollment patterns and graduation rates from the period before the closures. The schools were functioning. They were producing graduates. The pipeline existed, and it was closed. The consequences of that closure are still present in the current medical landscape. Today, less than 4% of practicing American doctors are black, in a country where black Americans represent approximately 13% of the population. More than 80% of black physicians practicing today trained at Howard or Meharry, the 2 schools that were not closed. The concentration of black medical training into 2 surviving institutions and the persistent underrepresentation of black physicians in the profession are direct structural consequences of what happened after 1910. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the closure of those schools did not only affect the diversity of the physician workforce in an abstract sense, it affected access to care in specific communities. Research has consistently found that patients are more likely to seek care, more likely to communicate openly, and more likely to follow through on treatment when they are treated by physicians who share their background and understand their community context. The removal of the pipeline for black physicians reduced the availability of that kind of care for black communities across the United States for an entire century. That is a measurable public health consequence, and it flows directly from an institutional decision made in 1910. The AMA formally apologized for its role in the school closures in 2008, 98 years after the report was published. That apology is in the record, but an apology issued a century after the fact does not restore the physicians who were never trained or the care that was never provided. It acknowledges the harm without reversing it, and the question of why the harm was allowed to persist for so long without institutional acknowledgement is itself a question that the official account has not fully answered. However, the timeline does not fully match the idea that these consequences were simply unforeseen. The people who coordinated the Flexner Report understood what medical schools did. They understood that closing them would reduce the number of practitioners trained by those institutions. The Carnegie Foundation and the AMA were not organizations unfamiliar with the relationship between institutional infrastructure and professional output. The consequences of closing schools were not invisible or unpredictable. They were the logical outcome of the action taken. Some believe that the architects of the Flexner process were focused on quality standards and did not adequately consider the access consequences for underserved communities, that the harm was real but incidental to a genuine reform effort. Others find that framing insufficient. They point to the documented coordination between the Carnegie Foundation and the AMA, to the specificity of which schools were targeted, and to the century-long persistence of the resulting access gap as evidence that what happened was not simply an oversight. Neither position can be fully proven from the available records, but the pattern they are both trying to explain is not in dispute. The consequences were real. They accumulated over time, and they fell most heavily on communities that were already underserved before the closures happened. This is the feature of the expanding problem that is most difficult to attribute to coincidence or oversight. In each episode examined in this investigation, the populations that lost the most were the ones that had the least institutional protection to begin with. The rural poor lost the monastery hospitals and the traditional healers. The communities dependent on local women with healing knowledge lost their practitioners. Black communities in America lost the medical schools that were training their physicians. The direction of loss was consistent. The populations carrying the greatest burden of that loss were consistent, and the official accounts that followed each disruption were consistent in framing what happened as reform rather than as removal. It doesn't fully make sense to describe all of these outcomes as unintended side effects when the direction of impact was the same every time. An unintended side effect that falls on the same population in the same direction across 3 different episodes, separated by centuries, is difficult to distinguish in its structural character from a feature rather than a bug. Whether it was a feature, whether it was designed rather than incidental, is not something the available records can definitively answer. But the question has been raised by the evidence, and it has not been closed by the explanations currently offered in the standard account. The communities affected, the populations that carried the weight of each transition, are waiting for a more complete answer than the history books have so far provided, and the investigation that would produce that answer has not yet been fully conducted. Any investigation that takes historical evidence seriously has to take seriously the people who read that evidence differently. That is not a concession to uncertainty for its own sake. It is a methodological requirement. An interpretation that cannot account for the strongest objections to it is not a complete interpretation. And the questions raised in this investigation have generated real objections from serious researchers whose work deserves careful consideration rather than dismissal. So this chapter does something different from the ones before it. Instead of building the case further, it examines the case against it, not to dismantle what has been established, but to test it, to see which parts hold under scrutiny and which parts require more careful qualification. Because that process is part of how any honest investigation works. The first and most significant objection concerns the witch trials themselves. The interpretation developed in earlier chapters suggests a meaningful connection between the persecution of traditional female healers and the parallel rise of formal credentialed medicine. The timing overlapped. The outcomes aligned. The populations affected were consistent. And the 2023 Scottish study, showing a 90% execution rate among those charged with healing-related offenses, provided a specific data point that is difficult to explain as pure coincidence. But a number of historians push back on this reading directly. Their objection is not that the overlap is imaginary. It is that the overlap is being interpreted in a way that imposes more coherence on the trials than the historical record actually supports. The witch trials, in this view, were not a coordinated campaign against healers. They were a chaotic, locally driven, highly inconsistent series of events whose primary targets were social outsiders of various kinds, widows without male protection, women involved in property disputes, individuals who had made enemies among people with community influence, people whose circumstances made them vulnerable to accusation regardless of what they did or did not practice. There's genuine evidence for this interpretation when the full range of witch trial records is examined rather than a subset focused on healing-related charges. The picture that emerges is considerably more varied. Many of those accused and executed had no documented connection to healing at all. Their charges had nothing to do with plant knowledge or midwifery or any medical practice. They were accused of cursing neighbors, of causing illness through malicious intent, of making pacts with supernatural forces. The accusations reflected the specific fears and conflicts of specific communities at specific moments. And the pattern, in many individual cases, looks more like the resolution of local social tensions than like any systematic campaign against a particular occupational group. This is a legitimate objection. It cannot be dismissed by pointing to the Scottish study alone. One study covering one country cannot establish that the trials were primarily about medical competition across the entirety of Europe over 3 centuries. The variation between regions, between periods, and between individual cases is real, and attributing a unified purpose to events that were, in many documented instances, Genuinely chaotic may be doing exactly what the objection charges, imposing order on disorder, reading a pattern into noise because the pattern is compelling rather than because the evidence fully supports it. At first, it seems reasonable to acknowledge this limitation and move on, but there is a problem with accepting the objection entirely. The Scottish study did not find a slightly elevated rate of execution among those charged with healing. It found 90%. That is not a marginal difference that could be explained by the general vulnerability of women in this period. It is a pronounced concentration of lethal outcome among a specific subset of accused people defined by a specific functional role. And that concentration exists within the chaotic, locally driven, inconsistent trial system that the objection correctly describes, which means the chaos and the concentration coexisted. The trials were messy and inconsistent overall, and still managed to kill healers at a disproportionate rate. Those two things are not mutually exclusive, and the objection, while valid in what it says about the general character of the trials, does not fully account for that specific number. The second major objection concerns the Flexner Report. The interpretation developed earlier treats the report as a mechanism of institutional consolidation that harmed access to care for underserved populations, particularly Black Americans, while benefiting a narrower credentialed group aligned with pharmaceutical-based medicine. The documented coordination between the Carnegie Foundation and the AMA provides specific evidence of deliberate intent rather than simply structural coincidence. But this interpretation also has serious critics. Some historians and medical scholars argue that many of the schools closed after the Flexner Report were genuinely producing undertrained practitioners, that the report identified real problems in medical education, that students were completing programs that did not adequately prepare them to treat patients safely, that the consolidation, however disruptive, moved American medicine toward a more consistent and more reliable standard of care, and that the improvements in patient outcomes that followed over the subsequent decades are evidence that the reform had genuine merit alongside its genuine costs. This argument deserves engagement. It is not simply a defense of the status quo. There were schools operating in early 20th century America that lacked adequate laboratory facilities, adequate clinical training, and adequate oversight of the knowledge their graduates actually possessed. The variation in quality across the landscape of American medical education in 1910 was significant. Standardization was a legitimate goal, and some of the schools that closed were, by documented accounts, providing inadequate preparation. However, the timeline does not fully match the idea that quality was the primary driver of which schools closed and which survived. The Black medical schools that were shut down were not uniformly the worst performing institutions in the system. Howard and Meharry, the two that survived, were retained, but the 5 that closed were not all clearly inferior to comparable white institutions that remained open. The selection of which schools were viable and which were not reflected a combination of factors, and quality was not always the most visible one among them. The funding decisions that followed the closures, with Rockefeller Foundation money flowing exclusively to schools adopting pharmaceutical-based models, suggest that the reorganization served specific institutional and economic interests alongside whatever quality standards were nominally being applied. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because a reform that claims to be about quality but produces funding distributions that consistently favor one treatment model over all others is not straightforwardly a quality reform. It is a quality reform with other things operating alongside it. Disentangling those things from each other is genuinely difficult, but the presence of documented coordination, of explicit back-channel communication between the evaluating foundation and the professional organization that stood to benefit most from the closures, makes the pure quality explanation insufficient on its own. The third objection concerns the historical systems that were lost. The Ottoman hospitals, the monastic infirmaries, the Asclepians of ancient Greece. These institutions have been discussed in ways that, some critics argue, romanticize what they actually were. The suggestion that these were universally accessible, free at point of care, comprehensively effective systems that served all populations equally is, in this view, an idealization that does not survive close historical scrutiny. There is something to this. The Ottoman hospital system, while genuinely impressive by the standards documented in primary sources, like Evliya Shalebi's travelogue, and corroborated by modern scholarship, was not uniformly available across the entire Ottoman Empire. It was concentrated in major cities. Rural populations had less reliable access. The wax system that funded the hospitals depended on the continued generosity and administrative competence of those managing the endowments, which varied over time and across regions. Similarly, the monastic hospitals of medieval England varied considerably in quality, accessibility, and the degree to which they actually served the poor rather than primarily serving paying guests or members of their own religious communities. Some believe that the idealization of pre-modern healing systems reflects a kind of nostalgia that distorts historical judgment, that looking backward for evidence of better systems is as likely to produce romanticized projections as accurate historical recovery, that the problems of traditional and pre-modern healthcare were real, and that the standard narrative of progress, while incomplete, is not simply fabricated. These are fair points. This investigation has not claimed that everything before formal medicine was better. It has claimed that specific things were lost, that those losses were real and measurable, and that the official account does not fully acknowledge them. Those claims do not require the pre-modern systems to have been perfect. They require only that the transition involved genuine losses alongside genuine gains, and that is a considerably more modest claim than idealization. But this is where it becomes unclear, because acknowledging the legitimacy of these objections does not dissolve the central question that the evidence keeps returning to. The objections work at the level of individual episodes. They complicate the witch trial interpretation. They add nuance to the Flexner narrative. They qualify the picture of pre-modern healing systems. All of that is appropriate and necessary. What the objections do not do is explain the consistency of the outcome. Each individual episode can be complicated by looking at its specific details, but when all three episodes are considered together, the directional result is the same each time. Healing became more expensive, access narrowed, control concentrated. The populations carrying the greatest burden of loss were consistently those with the least institutional protection, and the official accounts consistently described what happened as progress rather than as removal. That consistency across 3 different centuries, 3 different countries, 3 different mechanisms, and 3 different official justifications has not been fully explained by any of the objections currently available. The objections modify the interpretation at the edges. They prevent overstatement. They require careful qualification of specific claims. All of that is valuable, but they do not provide an alternative explanation for why the same directional outcome keeps appearing. Some researchers are comfortable leaving that question open. They argue that similar outcomes emerging from similar structural pressures across different historical periods is not surprising. That institutional consolidation, professional monopolization, and the political economy of expertise tend to produce the same results in many domains, not just medicine. That the pattern reflects something general about how power operates rather than something specific to healing. Others find that explanation too broad to be satisfying. Something general enough to explain everything explains nothing in particular. And the specific features of this pattern, the consistent targeting of the same populations, the consistent rewriting of the same narrative, the consistent economic outcome of replacing free access with paid access, are specific enough to deserve a more specific account. Neither position has produced a full explanation. The objections are real, and they are worth holding. The pattern they are trying to explain is also real, and it is worth holding. Both things are true simultaneously, and an investigation that cannot yet resolve the tension between them is not a failed investigation. It is an honest one. What remains, after examining the strongest objections available, is a question that those objections complicate, but do not close. Whether the consistency of the outcome across 5 centuries reflects intention, coincidence, structural tendency, or something that does not yet have a clean name. No single interpretation has fully accounted for it, and that unresolved space is where the final chapter of this investigation begins. An investigation that has covered 5 centuries of evidence eventually arrives at a point where it has to account for what it has found, not by forcing a conclusion onto material that resists one, but by honestly surveying the landscape that the evidence has produced and acknowledging what is clear, what remains uncertain, and what questions are still open after everything that has been examined. This investigation has covered a significant amount of ground. It began with a question that seemed unusual: whether the people labeled as witches across Europe were, in a meaningful portion of cases, the same people who had been providing healing to their communities. The evidence gathered since that opening question has been specific, documented, and drawn from sources that are publicly available and academically verified. None of what has been presented in this investigation required extraordinary claims. It required only that separate historical episodes be placed in sequence and examined for what they share. What they share is a pattern, and that pattern, across 5 centuries and multiple continents, has the same basic shape each time it appears. The shift that this investigation has tracked is not subtle. Across the period from roughly the 14th century to the early 20th century, healing knowledge moved. It moved from systems that were decentralized, community-based, and largely free at the point of care into systems that were centralized, institutionally controlled, credentialed, and expensive. That movement happened more than once. It happened through different mechanisms in different periods. It was carried out by different actors, using different justifications. But the direction of the movement was consistent, and the populations that bore the greatest cost of each transition were consistently the ones with the least institutional protection. The first major episode involved the dissolution of English monasteries under Henry VIII between 1536 and 1540. 900 institutions destroyed in 4 years. Among them were hospitals that had operated for centuries. St. Bartholomew's in London had been providing care since 1123. St. Leonard's in York had been one of the largest hospitals in all of Europe. When the monasteries were dismantled, the hospitals went with them. The wealth was redistributed to political allies. The buildings were stripped or demolished, and the healthcare infrastructure that those institutions had provided was not replaced. There were no provincial hospitals anywhere in Britain by 1735. Nearly 200 years of absence. The second episode unfolded across a longer period. Between the 1300s and the 1700s, the decentralized network of traditional female healers across Europe was systematically removed through 2 parallel mechanisms. Legal licensing laws made their practice illegal, and the witch trials removed many of them physically. The knowledge they held was absorbed into the formal pharmacological system without credit. The communities they had served lost access to the care they had provided, and the history that followed described the transition as the replacement of superstition with science, without accounting for what was lost or how the loss happened. The third episode was more recent and more documented. The Flexner Report of 1910, produced by a non-physician hired by the Carnegie Foundation and coordinated, as documented in writing, with the American Medical Association, led to the closure of more than half of all American medical schools within 25 years. Every homeopathic college closed. Every naturopathic college closed. 5 of 7 black medical schools closed permanently. The Rockefeller Foundation then directed funding exclusively toward schools adopting pharmaceutical-based treatment models. The knowledge traditions that fell outside that model received no institutional support and no pathway to survival within the new system. Each of these episodes was described, at the time and in the histories that followed, as reform, as progress, as the replacement of something inferior with something better. That framing is not entirely wrong in every case. Some things did improve. Some aspects of formal medicine represented genuine advances over what had existed before. The acknowledgement of those improvements is not in question here. What is in question is the completeness of that framing. Because reform that consistently reduces access for the poorest populations, that consistently concentrates control in a smaller group, that consistently absorbs the knowledge of the systems it replaces without crediting them, and that consistently rewrites the history of the transition to emphasize gains and minimize losses, is not straightforwardly the same thing as progress. It may contain progress, but it also contains something else, and that something else has not been fully named or accounted for in the standard account. Whether the something else was coordinated is the question that this investigation keeps returning to, and it is the question that the evidence addresses most unevenly. In the case of the Flexner Report, the coordination is documented. A letter exists, published in a peer-reviewed journal in 2025, in which Carnegie Foundation President Henry Pritchett described working hand in glove with AMA leadership and explicitly noted the importance of concealing that connection until the report appeared. That is not an inference. It is a primary source document. It establishes that at least one of the 3 episodes examined in this investigation involved deliberate, coordinated, and deliberately concealed institutional action toward a specific outcome. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the documentation that exists for the Flexner coordination does not extend backward in time to the witch trials or to the monastery dissolution with equivalent specificity. The dissolution was a royal policy. It had architects. Thomas Cromwell's role is documented. The legal mechanisms were deliberate, but whether the healthcare consequences were intended or incidental, whether the removal of hospital infrastructure was a goal or a side effect, is not established with the same directness as the Flexner coordination. The evidence is consistent with deliberate intent. It does not prove it, and the witch trials present an even more complex picture. The chaotic, locally driven, inconsistent character of the trials makes it genuinely difficult to attribute unified coordination to them. They happened across different jurisdictions, different legal systems, different religious contexts, over a period of centuries. The parallel legal campaign by university physicians to establish licensing monopolies was more organized. But whether those 2 processes were connected by design or simply reinforced each other structurally is not something the available records can answer directly. Some believe the absence of proof of coordination should significantly limit how much weight the pattern is allowed to carry. That identifying a sequence across separate historical episodes is not the same as demonstrating that those episodes are causally linked. That pattern recognition, without established mechanism, risks substituting a compelling narrative for historical evidence. This is a serious methodological point. It deserves acknowledgement rather than dismissal. Others argue that the standard of proof being applied is inconsistent, that the official narrative of medical progress also rests on interpretive frameworks that go beyond what the raw evidence directly establishes, that the choice to teach the Flexner Report as scientific reform rather than as institutional consolidation is itself an interpretive decision, one that has been made so consistently and for so long that it now appears to be simply factual. The question of what counts as sufficient evidence depends partly on which interpretation is being held to a higher standard, and in most educational contexts, the standard applied to the official account is considerably lower than the standard applied to interpretations that challenge it. That asymmetry is itself something worth noting, not as proof of anything, but as a feature of how historical knowledge is constructed and maintained. The documents that support the official account are in the curriculum. The documents that complicate it, the Pritchett Letter, the 2023 Scottish Study, the 2025 Curious Article, the primary source travelogue of Evliya Shalebi documenting the Ottoman music therapy hospitals. These are in academic journals and specialized archives. They are publicly available. None of them are hidden, but their absence from standard education is a fact about how knowledge is selected and transmitted, not just about what the evidence contains. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because an investigation that finds consistent patterns in the evidence, finds documented coordination in at least one major instance, finds that the standard account consistently omits or minimizes specific categories of information, and finds that the populations bearing the greatest cost of each transition are consistently the same populations, has arrived somewhere that is genuinely uncomfortable to leave unresolved. But unresolved is where it has to be left, not because the questions are unanswerable in principle, but because the evidence currently available does not support a definitive conclusion about intention across all 3 episodes. What it supports is a documented pattern with a documented mechanism in at least one case, a series of serious questions about the others, and a clear record of outcomes that have not been fully accounted for in the dominant historical narrative. The women who once treated their communities for free occupy a specific place in this record. They knew the plants. They understood the fevers. They assisted in the births. They were embedded in the communities they served in a way that no formal system has fully replicated. They were called witches. They were executed or legally barred. Their knowledge was used afterward by the system that replaced them, without credit, and placed behind a payment structure that did not exist before. And then they were largely forgotten. Not because what they knew was wrong. The evidence suggests it was often right, but because the history that followed was written by the institutions that replaced them. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the history that is written determines what questions get asked in the next generation. A history that describes the transition from traditional healing to formal medicine as the replacement of ignorance with knowledge does not produce researchers who look for what was lost. It produces researchers who measure what was gained. And what was gained is real, but what was lost is also real. And the full account requires both. However, the timeline does not fully match the idea that this investigation has reached its natural endpoint, because the pattern it has identified did not stop in 1910. The same structural logic that produced the monastery dissolution, the witch trials, and the Flexner Report, the labeling of existing systems as illegitimate, the legal or institutional removal of their practitioners, the absorption of useful elements into a new controlled system, the rewriting of history to describe the transition as progress. That logic did not expire with the 20th century. The questions about whether it continues to operate in the present are not questions this investigation has examined, but they are questions that the pattern raises. Whether that was design or accident across all of its instances is a question this investigation cannot answer with certainty. The evidence is uneven. The documentation is stronger in some cases than others. Reasonable historians disagree about how much weight the pattern should carry and what explains it. Those disagreements are real, and they are not resolved here. What can be said is that the pattern exists, that it is visible in documented sources, that its outcomes were real and measurable and fell consistently on specific populations, that the official accounts consistently describe those outcomes as progress, and that the questions raised by the gap between what the official account says and what the full record contains have not yet received answers that close them. An investigation does not always end with resolution. Sometimes it ends with a clearer picture of what remains to be understood. And the clearest thing this investigation has produced is not a conclusion. It is a set of questions that the standard account has not answered. Questions about who benefits when healing becomes expensive, about whose knowledge gets credited and whose gets absorbed without acknowledgement, about why the same populations keep carrying the heaviest costs of each transition, and about what it means that those questions are rarely asked in the places where history is taught. Those questions are sitting in the record. They have been sitting there for a long time, and they are worth sitting with.